Okay, so with the Cold War going on and this dispute between the USSR and the United States, lots of spies were in play here. We've talked about the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Russians, of course, the Soviets had their KGB. So the question became in the United States was, how many spies are there? Who's loyal to the United States and who's not loyal? And what do we do with those people that aren't loyal? So there was this whole Red Scare that breaks out, a second Red Scare. We had one in the 1920s, we have another one in the 1950s. And the question became, who are the spies and what's the loyalty factor? So the Loyalty Review Board was created, and that gave the United States government the authority to investigate federal employees. There were 3 million federal employees that were investigated under this. 3,000 of them resigned or were dismissed from their jobs because they were suspected spies or commies. We also had to take loyalty oaths, and this started with federal employees. As teachers, we still, when I started teaching, had to take loyalty oaths that we signed to say we were loyal citizens of the United States. Teachers especially were subject to this because of the whole freedom of speech First Amendment thing, that we could say anything to our kids and we could determine a lot of their fates basically by what we said in the classroom. So loyalty oaths were important, at least to the government. In 1938, the House created the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or HUAC. This committee had gotten a huge, probably a bad reputation for a number of reasons. They went after a lot of people that were suspected communists, but they were also tied to Joseph McCarthy and the whole McCarthyism scandal. And this is not the committee. Joseph McCarthy was not involved with this committee. He was a senator. This is a House committee. So he was not involved here. It's a bad misrepresentation of the committee. Nixon, however, Richard Nixon was on this committee, and in the late 1940s, he leads the attack, or leads the investigation, I should say, on 2 men, Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers. Whittaker Chambers was the international editor for Time magazine, and Alger Hiss, he was later convicted, not for spying, but for lying to a grand jury. So he was convicted for perjury and put in jail for that. The Red Scare is going to continue with Joseph McCarthy, the senator. He accuses a lot of State Department employees, as well as a whole mess of people from Hollywood. He had all these lists of communists that he was going to publish, and because he thought all these people were Soviet spies. I think today we recognize that Joseph McCarthy was just a touch radical in his beliefs, a lot radical in his beliefs. We passed the McCarran Internal Security Bill. Now, Truman vetoed this bill, but it passes over his veto. And what it said was the president had the right to detain or arrest anyone they thought was a threat during a time of domestic or international security. So if it was warranted and if we felt threatened, the president could arrest anybody he wanted. Truman didn't like it. He tries to veto it. That didn't work. Congress overrode his veto. And then we also see the arrest and the executions of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were, I talked about this earlier, they supposedly sold the secrets to the atomic bomb to the Soviets. Julius Rosenberg was thought to have done this, and they were both executed. Now, their kids were adopted by another family and have a different last name, but they've published a couple books that talk about how innocent their parents were, particularly Ethel. Because they don't believe she had anything to do, and the evidence kind of supports the fact that perhaps she was not involved necessarily in that spy ring, but then there's other evidence in the State Department that says she was involved. 1948, we have another presidential election because it's been 4 years. And the Democrats have a tricky deal here because they really want to grab Eisenhower and have Eisenhower run for them. The general says nothing doing. I'm not running for president. Forget it. So then the Democrats split. They weren't really happy with Truman, so they split between 2 other guys. One was Henry Wallace, and one was Strom Thurmond. Now, you have to understand that Strom Thurmond was still in the Senate when I was in my 20s. He died just a few years ago. He was like nearly 100 years old when he finally died. He was still a senator. And he was a senator here in 1948. This was one old dude. But the Democrats wanted to run either Henry Wallace, who was the vice president under Truman, or they wanted to run Strom Thurmond from South Carolina. They couldn't agree, however, so they finally compromised on, well, let's run Truman again. So they run Truman again, and the Republicans run Dewey again. Now, here's the problem, is that everybody thought Dewey was a shoo-in because the Democrats were split. So the next day, the Chicago Tribune, after the election, the Chicago Tribune prints on the front page of their newspaper, with big headline, probably the most disastrous newspaper mistake ever, they print, Dewey defeats Truman. No, he didn't. We never had President Dewey. Truman won this election, but the newspaper was in such a hurry to get the story out there that they printed this false headline. Truman's going to usher in the fair deal, sort of like the New Deal. A lot of the policies are the same. He wants to expand Social Security. He wants to raise minimum wage. He wants to do full employment. He wants to make housing available for people. He wants to... there's something I'm missing. Oh, create more Tennessee Valley authorities all across the nation and go from there. So that's the fair deal. Congress doesn't like the fair deal. So they vote it down. Almost all of the legislation that's attempted to be passed with that gets 86th. Now, Korea. The Cold War gets hot here. So we wind up in a hot war over Korea. Here's the way Korea was set up. There were two parts to Korea. The 38th parallel line of latitude marks the difference between North Korea and South Korea. The north of the 38th parallel was occupied by USSR forces, Soviet forces. South of the 38th parallel was the United States. In 1949, both sides withdraw their forces from the 38th parallel and basically pull back and take a breath. And then on June 25th, 1950, the Soviets cross that 38th parallel, come into South Korea, and all hell breaks loose. The National Security Council Memo number 68 orders a buildup of U.S. forces in South Korea, and we send in UN troops. So the UN unanimously condemns it. They send in UN troops, but they're mostly American troops, as they normally are. And we head into Korea to fend them off. Now, so the Soviet troops have come from the north to the south. What's going to happen is Douglas MacArthur is going to go in, and he's actually going to go in from the north and attack the Soviet troops from the north, as opposed to coming at them head on. He pushes North Korea back. He's able to get around them and push North Korea back over the 38th parallel, but there's a stalemate that breaks out. Nobody's doing anything. MacArthur wanted to go to full-out war. He wanted to declare a wholesale, full-scale war, and Washington, D.C., Truman especially, says, no, we don't want to do that. If we can avoid it, let's avoid it. And MacArthur gets very upset, and he openly complains about the bad decisions coming out of Washington. Well, that is insubordination. You don't question the president if you're a general, period. So Truman removes him for insubordination. He fires MacArthur, and MacArthur is livid. But when he gets home, what he finds is that he's actually the hero. MacArthur was celebrated by Americans, and he was welcomed home with open arms, where Truman was demonized. He was treated as the outcast. There was no way, even if Truman wanted a third term in office, he wasn't going to get it. They practically ran him out of Washington on a rail after this one.